To begin with Inca, the first step I'm gonna prepare for you the moist tender chocolate P125 cake. So to start with the first step, we need to take our butter and we put it in a container. And we're going to melt it with Cœur de Guanara P125 80% concentrated dark chocolate. So this has to go to the microwave to reach 45 degrees. The second step is we need to start to make the moist gluten-free tender chocolate cake. We need a mixing bowl and we need the paddle attachment. If you don't have the mixing bowl and the paddle attachment, you can use a food processor with a blade and you can do the same way that I'm going to show you now. So the first thing, we have roasted almond powder. We're going to place the almond powder in our mixer and the large amount of caster sugar and then the whole eggs, which is they are at room temperature. This is very important. The eggs has to be at room temperature to have a nice stability and to have good moisture when you bake your cake. Mix all that together using the machine and my paddle attachment. I have melted the chocolate with the butter at 45 degrees. Remember, this is the maximum temperature that you can reach to make it with your sponge. I'm going to start to add my melted chocolate and butter at 45 degrees on top of my almond mixture that we mix for 4 minutes, as we said. You have to make sure that the temperature of the mix, it shouldn't be cold, otherwise you start to crystallize your chocolate and that can affect the final result of the cake. So I'm going now to put it back in the machine and start to mix for another 3 to 4 minutes. My sponge is almost ready now. I'm gonna stop the machine and I'm gonna take it and transfer it to a bowl. And then I'm gonna start whipping the second part of the egg white with a small amount of sugar to have a meringue. And then after that, I'm gonna combine both mixture and then my cake will be ready to bake. So I will take my sponge, transfer it to a clean plastic bowl. Remember, this sponge is gluten-free. It's made from almond and concentrated dark chocolate. We're gonna put this on the side and then I'm gonna start whipping with my next bowl my small quantity of sugar and the room temperature egg white. So we start by adding the half of the sugar and then gradually, while mixing, we add the second part of the sugar in 2 times to avoid having lumps and to have very smooth and creamy meringue. And we start mixing the egg white into meringue. So I have added the second part of the sugar into the meringue. My meringue is perfectly whipped. I'm gonna stop the machine in just a few seconds and I'm gonna mix with my first mixture with the chocolate almond sponge, and then our cake is ready to be poured in the mold and to be baked. So the meringue is perfectly whipped. I'm going now to start to combine my meringue with my almond sponge. And the best way to avoid lumps is to add some of the mixture from the chocolate in the meringue and not the opposite side or the opposite way. You just take your whisk and then you just break the lumps of the meringue to make sure that the final texture of the sponge is perfectly smooth. So after I mix my sponge with a little bit of the meringue, I'm gonna transfer everything onto the mixture of the chocolate sponge. And I'm going to mix delicately to avoid lumps and to have something very smooth. And my biscuit is ready to go in the oven. The smell is incredible. So I'm gonna just now mix gently like that. We need really to go the minimum of work, because otherwise you will remove all the volume and the air from the sponge, and then you lose the moist and the humidity. So just gently like this. The sponge now is perfectly ready, and look at this beautiful texture. And now we're ready to bake it in the mold. My sponge is ready. Now it's time to put it in my mold. I have chosen a FlexiPan frame. The size is 20 by 20 centimeter. This is nice for baking the sponge because it's rigid, it's hard, so the sponge won't get deformed when you bake it. So I'm placing it on a rack. Make sure you have a rack because you have nice rotation of air while you're baking it. I'm gonna put now my sponge inside my silicone frame. And I'm gonna bake it at 170 degrees for 25 minutes. So I'm going now to take my spatula and just make sure that my sponge is perfectly flat and straight. So I just tap my, my rack just to make sure that we have very flat surface and we don't have air bubbles, and the sponge will be very nice in the oven, so we will have nice and flat top and when we take it out from the oven. So now it's ready to be baked at 170 degrees for 20 to 25 minutes. It all depends what kind of oven you're using, convection, static, modular. The most important is when it's baked, you have to put a knife, and when the knife is coming out completely dry, that means it's done. So my sponge now, it's almost baked. I'm gonna check by controlling with a knife, the blade of the knife. I'm gonna put my blade of the knife inside the sponge, and then if it's coming out dry, that means my sponge is perfectly cooked, and we let it cool down outside to just make sure that we have very smooth and flat surface. So I'm gonna check by putting, and it's beautiful. My knife is completely dry, my cake is baked, and it's time to let it cool down for the next step. For Inca tender chocolate sponge, I use Cœur de Guanara, concentrated dark chocolate, very low in cocoa butter. The reason why I use it, because it gives you an amazing texture, because it's very low in cocoa butter, and very intense flavor because it's concentrated dark chocolate. And this is the best option if you want to have nice intensity, nice aroma, and very low in cocoa butter to have something very tender and moist. As you can see on the bag, they mentioned Cœur de Guanara. The percentage of cocoa is 80%, but you see on the top there is P125. P, it's coming from power, and 125 is mean 125%. So the power of this chocolate, because it's concentrated, is 125%. If you don't have the product, you can use any dark chocolate, high in intensity, like Guanara 70% or Araguani 72%, on any dark chocolate with high intensity and good aroma. I'm going now to take a plastic wrap and just cover my sponge like this. This is to keep the maximum of humidity inside my cake. And we're gonna put it in the fridge overnight. What's gonna happen is that the cake will absorb humidity from the fridge, and then all the humidity inside the cake will remain inside because we cover while it's still warm, and the cake will be extremely moist with this technique. If you don't do this step, you can use the sponge on the spot or directly. You have to let it cool down, of course. But if you do that, that will give you a better texture, and you will add more humidity inside, and then it will be more flavorful.